When you enter a cave, who do you expect to see there? Bats? Some lizards, maybe a resting predator, or a couple of archaeologists? But definitely not an elephant. It's hard to see what elephants could possibly need in the caves. These huge herbivores appear to have no reason to be inside a mountain where there's no vegetation for them to eat. At first sight, this might seem right. However, in addition to plants and fruits with their vitamins, elephants also need a source of sodium to feel healthy. Elephants get their sodium from the woody plants and water they consume, but this is often not enough. That's when elephants start eating soil and licking rocks. But the elephants of Mount Elgin National Park on the Kenya-Uganda border have gone one step further, learning to quarry sodium-rich rocks in caves right inside the extinct Mount Elgin volcano. The mountain rises more than 13,000 feet above the surrounding plains, but that doesn't stop elephants from looking for salt deposits in its caves. It's true these caves are located on the lower slopes, but we'll talk about elephants and heights later. The length of the Elgin Caves reaches 490 feet, width 200 feet, and height about 33 feet. That's enough to fit several large animals who have the urge to lick the stones. However, there's some evidence to suggest that the caves owe their size to the elephants. Take the Kittim Cave, for example. Elephants have been venturing deep into this cave for centuries in search of salt. They break off pieces of the walls with their tusks and leave scratches and grooves, thereby expanding them. Of course, it took a long time, but it's unlikely anyone put elephants on a deadline. It's worth saying that not only elephants come to these caves looking for salt, but other animals as well, including buffaloes and hyenas. But let's focus on elephants for now. They break off pieces of the cave wall and then chew and swallow them, leaving long scratch marks all over the wall. Elephants can chisel the walls for hours and eat large quantities of salt at a time, since they usually don't come back until a few weeks later. Actually, elephants have quite an appetite for salt. One young male in Aberdare National Park in Kenya was seen eating 31 to 44 pounds of salted soil in 45 minutes. According to another observation of an elephant calf eating rocks in Kittim Cave, researchers established that, on average, it retrieves about 0.5 gallons of rocks from the cave. An adult elephant may require 0.16 to 0.22 pounds of sodium daily. Unfortunately for elephants, not only scientists but predators too know about their addiction to salt. They often hide in dark caves to ambush the unsuspecting elephant calves as their easy targets. Alas, during the 1980s, poachers discovered information about the elephants in caves, resulting in devastating consequences. Poachers hid at the entrance to the caves and ambushed the elephants as they approached. From more than 1,200, the population of elephants at Mount Elgin has dwindled to less than 100. But don't think the elephants didn't react to this. They are, after all, very intelligent animals. They've become much stealthier and have begun to avoid the popular places where they used to go to get salt. By the way, why did the elephants choose to explore the caves in this region rather than sticking with usual sources like soil and rocks? Well, on the African plains, they usually find sodium in pools rich in minerals. But there are very few such sources of salt on Mount Elgin because of the dense vegetation and high rainfall. Fortunately, the mountain's past as a volcano has created layers from which elephants pick whatever they need. Now let's get back to elephants' climbing skills. It may seem strange, but elephants are well known for their incredible ability to climb steep slopes when they have to. Well, at least that's what scientists say. In fact, young elephants can climb trees to get fruit. How the trees can stand it's not entirely clear. However, a satellite study showed that elephants avoid moving around on slopes if possible. Metabolism seems to be the reason for that. Elephants have a perfectly balanced metabolism. They know perfectly well how much and what they need to eat to cover long distances, and they don't consume extra calories. But climbing is a different matter. Even a small hill represents a significant energy barrier for an animal as heavy as an elephant. They need to eat for several hours more to compensate for climbing up. There are even precise calculations. An elephant would need 1 extra hour of foraging to climb 650 feet, assuming that 3 feet make for 1 step. It's also been estimated that for elephants, climbing 3 feet requires 25 times as much energy as walking on level ground. So no wonder these large animals try to avoid climbing unless they absolutely have to.
I have the high ground! You underestimate my power!
And yet, the ability of elephants to climb mountains has been used since before our era. During the Second Punic War between Rome and Carthage, General Hannibal made a bold and very unexpected move. He led his troops, including cavalry and African war elephants, across the Alps. While Rome thought that the Alps, Europe's highest mountain range, would be a natural defense, Hannibal did the impossible. His exact route is unknown, but according to various assumptions, it lay at an altitude of 6,500 or 9,800 feet above sea level. Keep in mind, the Alps are steeper on the Italian side, and the path is narrow and surrounded by precipices. The army lost both men and elephants during the ascent and descent. Because of the snow, anyone who stepped past the trail or stumbled would lose their balance and fall into the abyss. By the end of the journey, the elephants were in a miserable state because of the harsh conditions and starvation, and given everything I've just described, that's not surprising. Imagine how much energy it took the animals to make such an ascent. This episode, by the way, can be seen in the Total War Rome 2 trailer. Perhaps if someone told the elephants there was a lot of salt on the other side of the Alps, the ascent would have been easier for them. But elephants aren't the only ones willing to go to great lengths to get access to the sodium that's so essential for life. Pigeons need it too. The daily sodium dose for the birds is much lower, and pigeons typically get their salt from the usual plant and animal food sources. However, during the period when pigeons are feeding their chicks, this is no longer enough. But you can't pick caves when you're a pigeon, especially since there are no caves nearby anyway. So some London pigeons have come up with an alternative for getting enough salt: human urine. It may sound disgusting, but just think about it. England is world famous for its pubs, where people drink and eat something salty. For various reasons, not all visitors use restrooms. Many do their business outside. And for the city, it's certainly a problem that has to be addressed. In some places, the problem's so serious they have to install special deflectors on the walls. Metal strips are angled so that anyone who decides to use the wall, in effect, pisses on his own feet. But back to the pigeons. They sure don't mind people going outside to relieve themselves. Human urine already contains a certain amount of salt, which only increases when they eat very salty food. This is why pigeons can often be spotted pecking at brick or stone walls and fences. They do this so often that in many places the damage they do can be seen on the surface. It's not as bad as in African caves, of course. Pigeons are smaller after all. Parrots, meanwhile, prefer to eat clay. Along the open riverbanks in the western part of the Amazon basin, within the borders of Peru, the macaws and other parrots of all colors of the rainbow flock by the hundreds to collect clay, and for a long time people had no idea why the birds might need it. It's not like they'd build their nests out of it. Moreover, witnesses repeatedly saw parrots eating clay. At first, researchers thought that the birds were doing this to neutralize toxins from plants because that's what some other animals do. But later it turned out that parrots simply lack salt because the farther the area from the ocean, the less salt there is in the precipitation. The high precipitation levels wash sodium away from the soil, which leaves birds no choice but to consume clay. Well, it's not like they have other options. The goats came up with a slightly different strategy. They use humans. I mean, they can, of course, look for natural sources of the much-needed sodium, and they do it in wild places, but why would they need it if there are people around? Generally speaking, the craving for salt is common to all species. But now I want to talk specifically about mountain goats, which can be a real threat. In 2010, a big mountain goat gored a tourist to death in Olympic National Park. And that's just the most brutal case, because tourists constantly complain about the aggressive behavior of mountain goats. The thing is, the animals, which can walk up to 20 miles in search of natural sources of salt, often view humans as mobile and more accessible salt deposits. People have salt in their urine, salty snacks they carry with them, and sweat that accumulates on their clothes and backpacks. In addition, there are more people in the mountains every year, which means that goats get used to them. It's fine if the animal just starts licking a puddle of urine or your backpack, but what if it decides to lick you? People are salty too. And this really happened. Honestly, I don't want to be licked by a mountain goat, or any other goat for that matter. The problem of goats being aggressive and addicted to human salt has become so serious it's led to quite an unusual solution: airlifting. Hundreds of mountain goats have been removed from tourist spots to force them back to seek natural sources of salt. Yes, it's more difficult and requires more effort and time, but the goats can't keep licking tourists all the time. And since the terrain in the park is rocky, the easiest way to relocate the goats is by helicopter. At first, the animals are spotted from the air, and then they're shot with a tranquilizer dart, and then the already sedated animals are secured in a bag suspended from the helicopter. That's it. All that's left is to carry the goats to their new home. But as I said, it's not just wild mountain goat species that have been spotted licking things that aren't supposed to be licked. In 2018, an NYPD officer was dispatched to a call after a car driver reported a stray goat. Arriving at the scene, the officer found an entire herd on the side of the road. And the herd was very happy to see him. It was winter, and the roads were covered with salt because of the heavy snowfall, which meant that the salt also covered cars. The goats quickly figured this out and began to lick the patrol car. The officer was somewhat surprised by what was happening. Well, you can understand him. Police officers aren't trained to deal with being ambushed by goats. However, goats aren't the only animals willing to lick cars for precious salt. Cars in national parks often attract moose and deer. What about smaller animals? If you've ever had a butterfly land on your hand, you've probably thought it was acting really cute. And you may have felt a little bit like a Disney princess. Though actually, this butterfly may have a clear goal in mind: to lick the sweat off your skin. Butterflies, like some other insects, actively seek out moist surfaces such as puddles, rotting plants or animals, feces, and even blood, sweat, and tears. After finding something wet enough, butterflies use their long proboscis to suck up liquids containing sodium and amino acids. This behavior is most often observed in males and is thought to contribute to their reproductive success. Yup, you lick off human sweat, now you're an alpha male. All the ladies are yours. But you know what I found particularly surprising? Gritting roads with salt literally makes the butterflies stronger. At least that's the conclusion we can make from a study conducted by the University of Minnesota. Male insects that ate sodium-rich plants had bigger muscles and females had bigger eyes. Their brain size and wingspan increased too. And that means more comfortable and successful migration, reproductive success, and all that sort of thing. That's what it means to settle in a good neighborhood. Bees love and need salt too, but they often, let's just say, take it too far. Have you heard of saltwater swimming pools? That's a great thing that doesn't require chlorine or other chemicals, but there's a hiccup. Such pools attract a lot of honeybees, and for good reason. Scientists have discovered that bees have taste receptors on their feet that are so sensitive to salt that they even dwarf the bees' ability to taste sweets. Bees may not even need to land on the surface of water to sense it's salty. They first sense it, and then they land, only to drown right away. This happens so often that saltwater pool owners regularly complain on forums about having a bunch of bees, both dead and alive, in their backyards. Knowing bees' love of salt water and how much these insects need salt, beekeepers add salt to special feeders. They're safe, and this way no bee will drown. Salt's an intriguing substance with a dual nature. Its deficiency can cause disease and death in animals, while its excess can also be lethal. And I'm not talking about excessive salt content in the body. Sometimes it's enough to have plenty of salt everywhere. You've probably heard of a lake that turns any animal that touches its water to stone. Well, if you haven't, let me explain. Such a place really exists. And not a favorite resort of Medusa from the myths, Lake Natron is located in Africa, in the north of Tanzania. And it looks pretty scary because of the color of its water. But once you get close to it, it's clear that the color is the least of its problems. The concentration of salt in the water and its alkalinity are so high that any animal that falls into the lake will quickly decompose. If an animal falls near the shore, it gets covered with a crust of salt that stays with it forever. This lake is dangerous due to the nearby volcano. The emissions from it end up in the lake through streams and make it very alkaline. Flamingos often become the victims of Lake Natron, but it's worth saying that flamingos in general can have problems caused by salt, especially when the birds are very young. Flocks of flamingos fly to the salt plains in Africa every year to mate and raise their chicks. By the time their babies are born, most of the water's dried up, so they have to waddle up to 31 miles just to have a drink. As flamingos run across the arid terrain, remnants of water build up on the chicks' feet, which combined with leftover salt creates giant salt boots. The chicks try to cope with them, but inevitably fall behind. Can they survive with such a burden on their feet? It remains to be seen. And finally, the story that really struck me. We all know how fresh water works. It quenches our thirst. Salt water, on the opposite, only makes you thirstier. If you drink seawater, your kidneys will struggle to get rid of the extra salt by diluting it in your urine, and you'll expel more water than you get. In short, it's no good. Many marine animals completely avoid ingesting seawater and get fresh water from the food they eat. Turtles, seabirds, and marine iguanas have special glands to get rid of salt. Scientists thought the same is true for sea snakes. Turns out it's not. After spending a long time in salt water, sea snakes end up being dehydrated. Turns out their ability to turn salt water into fresh water is just a myth. The irony is that a snake that spends its entire life in the sea, constantly immersed in water, suffers from thirst and dehydration for months. The only source of water for it is rain. When it rains over the ocean, the precipitation doesn't immediately mix with the water, but form either a fresh or slightly salty layer. In addition, researchers have noticed that if there's no rain for a long time, like during a drought, the snakes mysteriously disappear. They seem to just die of thirst. I don't know about you, but I feel sort of thirsty now. I think I'm gonna get some water. See you later.